feel free. Yeah, so this is, we're excited to have you guys here. This is in part brought to you by the Tague Institute, so they help us advertise this, so you guys might see posters around campus. And basically in this series, we kind of engage various aspects of sustainability right here on campus. So we have a whole library of other videos that we've been, of events that we've been doing since fall 2016. And our next event will be with Marianne Robbins. That'll be March 25th, it's a Monday. Another thing to check out is, in association with this event here, is the Watershed exhibit in the Ridley Tree Museum of Art. So this is very much associated in collaboration with that as well. This Saturday we're going to be having a garden day, so a garden work day at 9 a.m. That's also kind of another event through the Art Museum's programming, but I'll be hosting that to give a tour and maybe put you guys to work if you guys are interested. So with that, we're going to kick off our panel. So we're just going to kind of go down the line here, and if you guys wouldn't mind introducing us with your name, an organization, if you're with an organization, and kind of briefly describing the purpose of your own work as pertaining to watersheds.
So am I gonna?
Yeah, you can go first.
Okay. My name is Nell Campbell. I'm a documentary photographer. I also do commercial work here in Santa Barbara, photographing events for nonprofits in the university. I'm not associated with an organization. I'm an independent kind of person, and I got on this panel via the show. And my sort of connection with Watershed is I grew up in Louisiana, which I read today, the Mississippi River is the largest watershed in the United States. I should have known that, but I didn't know it before today. And so I grew up in southern Louisiana and southwestern Louisiana, which if you ever fly over it, you feel like you're just looking at water. It seems like there's not much dry land, but I grew up spending time in marshes and bayous and rivers, swimming, fishing, water skiing, and those. And I've done a number of documentary projects based on panorama landscapes of wetlands, mostly marshland, and I've been working on a project of handmade duck blinds in a river called the Calcasieu River, and they're kind of a form of vernacular architecture. And so, I lived here a long time, but I know more about water in Louisiana.
Great. So my name is Julia Keanne. I'm an environmental educator at Explore Ecology, which most people know it as Art from Scrap downtown. So Explore Ecology, we're the umbrella organization for Art from Scrap, and we also have environmental education in-class programs and then school gardens. So if you ever go to a local school around here, we usually have a garden educator at that school. So my job is to teach kids what a watershed is, because a lot of people don't know exactly what the definition of a watershed is. Kind of maybe even what their specific watershed is, so if they know the creek next to their house, or the lake or river, etc. And then how their actions on land impact water. So we have one of our more popular field trips is the field trip to the Watershed Resource Center at Hendry's Beach, or Aurora Beach if you've ever been there. It's that blue building next to the restaurant. So we teach kids all about watershed with a big map that's outside of that building, kind of describing all of the watersheds in the area. And then we take them down to the estuary that's flowing straight into the ocean, and do water quality testing and kind of talk more about pollution and how it moves through the land. So our big objective is to make sure kids know, water is definitely impacted by land use.
I'm Naomi Tague. I'm a professor at UCSB at the Brennan Institute for Environmental Science and Management. So I guess I'm the science geek on the panel here. I actually started my career doing systems design engineering. So I in part came from computer science. So you might wonder why I'm studying water. When really what I did was develop complex simulation models. But one of the ways to understand how watersheds work And they really do work, they do things, right? They cycle water, they cycle nitrogen, they cycle energy, plants grow in watersheds. So one way to kind of get a handle on how all that works is to develop these fairly complicated computer models. So that's what I do. I'm kind of a cross, I would say, between an ecologist, because I look a lot at vegetation and fire and what happens to plants and how they change over time, but also water. I'm a card-carrying hydrologist. And a computer scientist, because I investigate this by taking data from the kind of samples that your kids are taking to satellite data and using informatics and computer science to put all that together. So that's what I do.
Awesome. So the term watershed is not a really common word in daily life. And even in the midst of such activism around environmental issues currently, it's not just that's not a word that comes up very often. Why do you, as individuals, care about this issue, and why should this be something that we're thinking about? What's at stake, I suppose, is another way to think about it.
Okay. Well, that's a big question.
That's what we're here for.
I come from a big watershed, though, and the town that I grew up in, mostly in Lake Charles. I spent a lot of time in New Orleans too. But Lake Charles has a lake. It has several lakes. It has a river. It has a ship channel. It has an intercoastal canal. It has many marshes and bayous, and it has much industry. And it has a lot of problems with pollution. So that's part of my interest in watersheds, and I'm interested in them visually and as recreation, fishing, and I'm not personally a hunter, but I've been photographing these hunting structures. But pollution's a real problem. Well, it's a problem everywhere, but it's a huge problem in Louisiana. They've done a lot less about it than most other places. And a woman who's a sociologist at Berkeley, Arlie Hochschild, wrote a book a couple of years ago where she interviewed people in my hometown, Lake Charles, and in Cancer Alley, which is a stretch of the Mississippi River between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, about why that they really love the land, but they vote against people who will improve the environment. It's a very powerful book, and I have to confess, I was so depressed after 85 pages, I haven't finished it. But there's some very interesting, there's also recently I read that about a group, because Louisiana gives more concessions to industry and corporations than other states do, even states like Texas who are conservative like Louisiana. And there's a move to educate, there's a very interesting film online, to educate people about, you could be paying the teachers more if you weren't paying somebody $32 billion to put their refinery here or their LNG plant. So there's I come from that, and Santa Barbara is so much more environmentally aware and active than Louisiana is. So that's a lot of my interest.
So you kind of were connected to the water growing up,
Right.
in Louisiana.
Right. I spent a lot of my youth on the water. And I've lived here a long time, and I walk at Henry's every day, and I haven't looked at that watershed map. I need to look at it, but I'm not, if I have to think of, we have the whole ocean, but we don't really have big rivers here. We don't have the Mississippi, so it's a different kind of thing.
So you're kind of teaching kids from a young age about the concept of watersheds. Is this something that you grew up with as well? Or?
Yeah, so I came from the Chesapeake Bay watershed, which is also huge. 6 states feed into the Chesapeake Bay. So I also grew up knowing that, our water is being impacted by agriculture and lots of industry and things like that. And when I moved to California about a year and a half ago, I realized that kids here are more, they know about the ocean, but they don't know about the creek near their house or the river or the lake where their drinking water comes from and things like that. So working at Explore Ecology, I think it's really nice that I have the mountains right there and the ocean right there, and I can just point to it and they see it visually, but growing up I just kind of knew that, the Chesapeake Bay is right there and it's huge and you know where all the pollution comes from. But I did a Google search about the word watershed, and I came up with lots of different meanings. And I think that's just, it's inherently confusing to people because they know what it is, but if you ask them for a definition, no one can really give it to you very clearly. So just so you'll know, when we say it to kids, we say it's, you know, the area of land where water is draining into a bigger body of water. So I think people think more about the water, but they don't think about how land use is impacting the water itself. So we try to teach kids that if you care about clean water, you should care about watersheds. You should care about, you know, what you do in your neighborhood or at your school, and all the trash from the land is ending up at our beaches, and it, you know, we see it every single day. So I care about it because, you know, I care about water, and it's so interconnected through all these different ecosystems, and you know, the earth works as a whole. You can't just pick and choose different environmental issues. So I feel like water is the one that a lot of people have some sort of personal connection to. So that's why I like teaching about it.
And what's your stake in the
I like the way you're explaining it. It's good, it's good. Give me a good definition. So, you know, I was thinking about this, like, why watersheds? And, you know, watersheds are, in a way, they're a way of breaking up the landscape into pieces, right? And this is gonna seem like a tangent, but one of my favorite books is a book by Oliver Sacks, right, who talks about different things. And one of the things he said that always struck me is like vision. You know, they did research on people who are blind from birth, and then you give them vision. And they actually can't figure out, when they get their vision, they can't see. Why? Because they can't break the world up into pieces. When you're looking at something, you're very active. You know, this is a whole person, this is foreground, this is background. So a lot of understanding anything comes from how you break it up into pieces. That's how we make the world manageable. Otherwise, it's just chaos, right? So watersheds are a really good way of making sense of the world. It's a really good way of breaking up the world for the reasons that you're mentioning, right? Watersheds are cool because they're scalable. You know, a watershed is really the area that contributes to any point on a stream. So if you go up the stream, that watershed, you still have watersheds, they just get smaller. So you can go from the Mississippi, which drains, I think, a third or more of the whole US, to, you know, there's a stream gauge at Rocky Nook Park, right, the Mission Creek, and that's that tiny little watershed. But what's cool about looking at watersheds, and because they integrate the water, any little raindrop is going to come out eventually in that stream. So it's a good way of seeing what's going on in a whole area. It's like taking, you know, when you go to the doctor and they take a sample of your blood, they can see what's going on in all these different organs, because that blood is circulating through your body. The same thing is, because streams get water from all parts of the watershed, they're a good way of sort of, a good indicator of what's happening, right? If you have a fire in a watershed, you're going to see it in the stream flow, right? If you start dumping some kind of toxin in the watershed, it may take sometimes decades, but you're going to see it in that water. So it's a really good way of breaking up this huge landscape. It doesn't work for everything, because some things cross watershed boundaries. Animals, for example, don't, you know, they will just cross from one watershed to the other. They don't really care, right? But because water carries so many of the things we care about, right? Like pollution, but also they give you a sense, you know, water feeds all of the vegetation in the landscape. It's just a really good way of making sense. Watersheds are good ways of making sense of what's going on in a really complicated environment, actually.
You said you came from a kind of a computer background.
Yeah.
What kind of brought you into the watersheds area?
So, you know, I loved math. I sort of came from, you know, I liked math and computer science. I liked thinking that way. But I didn't want to just do math. I wanted to do something that meant something to me. And I actually grew up in Canada, in Newfoundland, where there's water everywhere. It's no wonder I studied water, right? I came from a place where there were huge rivers and lakes everywhere. If you look at a geologic map of Newfoundland, it's more water than land. even on the inside. So I wanted to apply those skills to something that I found interesting. And for me, water is interesting in so many ways because, you know, water availability, plants use water. You know, we need water to survive. So on one hand, it's really important because we drink it, vegetation drinks it. But the other thing about water is it connects everything, right? It's why, you know, it is how the terrestrial environment connects to the ocean, which is why your kids, it's so great that you're explaining that to them. So you can care about what's happening in the ocean, but what affects the ocean is what comes off the land. And most, not always, but much of the way stuff gets there is coming out of watersheds. So it was a good place for me to be a math geek because I love water and I love landscapes.
So, I mean, it seems like the kind of, whole concept of watersheds it can be maybe hard to parse out exactly, well, what is this one a watershed, or like maybe one, what we would call a watershed contains many different watersheds inside of it. So it's obviously, it's a very complex and interconnected issue. So there are many ways that people might kind of address such a complex issue. So if you wouldn't mind telling us a bit about why you've chosen the specific area of work and how the specific work that you do as a kind of point of intervention, like whether that's educating the public or maybe educating more in higher education, if you could give us a bit of an insight as to how you landed in doing the specific work that you're doing in this mission.
I don't necessarily see my work as intervention. I've done a lot of projects. I've been photographing for 50 years, and I've been photographing political demonstrations for 50 years. I photographed Mardi Gras for a number of years in New Orleans. I did a thing, I talked earlier, I did a panorama landscape series in the marshes near where I grew up. And I've been working on the Stuck Line series. And I photographed after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. And I did because I felt like I had to. I felt like I had to witness it because Katrina affected Mississippi. I was born in Biloxi, Mississippi. It affected New Orleans, where I had lived and gone to school. And then 3 weeks later, we had Hurricane Rita that affected Lake Charles in southwestern Louisiana. And I felt sort of like, oh, now I know what people feel like who were exiled from their homeland. I almost felt, because it was, my whole growing up from Mississippi all the way to Louisiana was had been damaged, very severely damaged. And so I went back to photograph it because I felt like I needed to witness it, and I needed to, be there for my family was fine, but I needed to be there. And so I had never photographed after, well, that's not entirely true, because when I was 11, there was a big hurricane, and I have some snapshots I took after the hurricane, which I found, years later. But I photographed here after the tea fire, and I had never photographed here after any of the fires. But I think after I photographed after the hurricane, I felt motivated to photograph after the tea fire. And I've never shown those photos. I've shown one of them, which was the Mount Calvary, where some Episcopal brothers were, and I got to be friends with them and did some things for them, and did some photos for their newsletter after that. I showed one of those photos. But I've never shown them. And I didn't photograph specifically after the debris flow. It was interesting and fascinating and disturbing, and they were asking people to stay out of the way, so I didn't want to be in the way, and I didn't want to endanger myself. And I photographed a man hired me to photograph his house that had been damaged. It was a small house. And then he hired me to photograph it as it was being demolished, as the crew was demolishing it. And in that process, I came across the footprints. This was like in June, so 5 months, 6 months after the debris flow, and so everything was dry, all the mud was dry, but there were these footprints, and I said, what, I was on the other side of the creek, and I said, what are these? And he said, well, they were the footprints of the first responders. And so I photographed them, I photographed a few of them. And then a few months later, I photographed some more at some property that a friend of mine had where her house where she had raised her children had been destroyed. And so she said I could photograph them there. So I photographed, this was like August, and then I photographed those again in November. And I made a grid of those photos. I don't know if this is the answer to the question or not. But I made a grid of those photos, and that is in the show at Westmont. And I didn't start out with that particular intention, but after Judy invited me to be in the show, and I thought, at first I thought, well, I don't really have anything that relates to this, because she wanted something that was local, but was Santa Barbara. And then I thought about the footprints. So then that's when I went back and photographed more footprints and put them into a grid. What was the question?
It was just generally how you like chosen your line of work to be an area of impact for
Right.
the world.
Yeah, I think partly, a lot, my interest in work, I'm not seeing that I don't have any idea that I'm changing the world, or I'm a recorder, I'm a documentary person, and I'm interested in culture, and I'm interested in landscape, and I'm interested in photography, and any excuse to photograph is good.
Yeah, it sounds like, the main word that stood out to me in what you do is that you want to be a witness, and you kind of said that you felt like you had to do it.
Right.
Would you be willing, can you explain a bit more about what that call was to kind of be a witness for?
Well, because it so affected me emotionally and deeply, because I'm so attached, Louisiana is the kind of a place that I feel more attached to, even though I've lived here longer, because it's such a different culture, it's such a different place. I have and it's where I came from, so I have this big attachment to it. And after the hurricane, I spent like 6 weeks reading the paper every morning, trying to figure out what was going on, because it was hard to know what was going on. And some friends and I put together a fundraiser, and it was a group of caterers and myself, and I just tacked up photos at a gallery, and these people cooked this incredible spread of food, and we raised money and we gave it to Direct Relief and to Habitat for Humanity. And I felt like I needed to go there after, I wanted to see what was going on. I wanted to see my family, and it was kind of, I flew to Houston instead of New Orleans. It would have been cheaper to fly to New Orleans at that point, but I didn't feel like wasn't ready to go in the airport where I'd seen, old people lying on the baggage carousels as they were evacuating people. It felt too scary. So I flew to Houston, and I drove from Houston to my hometown, Lake Charles, which is like 130 miles. And when I got off the interstate to go to my sister's house, it was very disturbing because the tree cover was completely different. And Lake Charles is, it's a wetland, and the trees was totally different. The tree cover was totally different. And then when I got to New Orleans for I stayed with some friends. I went back 4 different times over a year. But when I got to New Orleans, I couldn't really function very well for the first few days because it felt so weird, and I felt, I didn't want to be like a looky-loo, and I didn't want to offend anybody. There weren't many people around to offend. People were back, the water was gone. This was the beginning of November. And then the next year, a year later, I had a show of what I had done in those 4 trips. And partly, too, the other thing was, Rita's kind of the forgotten hurricane because everyone focused on New Orleans because everyone knows about New Orleans. So it was kind of, the photos I shot in Lake Charles and in the marsh, most of the Lake Charles didn't have much water damage. It had a lot of wind damage. But there's a marshy area, it's called Cameron Parish, below Lake Charles, below the parish. They call them parishes, not counties, but it's a very rural area. It's one of the least populated counties in the country, and now it's getting full of industry, but people used to make their living off the land there by hunting and trapping and shrimping, and it's marshland and prairie, and it was, it was like everything. It's not the first hurricane there, but anyway, the photos that I photographed and shot there were in their magazine in in Louisiana, it's just called Louisiana Cultural Vistas, it's the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities. And they wanted to show what went on in Southwest Louisiana because they felt like it was neglected, even in Louisiana, that people weren't paying attention to it in the way they were paying attention to New Orleans. And that's true of Mississippi too, because, you know, New Orleans got all the attention, not that that's necessarily bad, but that's just the way it worked out. So,
Well, thank you for calling attention to something that's very important and definitely impactful. I remember walking through the show and seeing your piece. I was definitely stopped and was definitely considered what that was like. So thank you for that. Julia, why teach the kiddos about watersheds?
Well, so you know that like one field trip that you've been on as a kid, or that lesson that, you know, just happened to be one day in school that you'll like never forget. You'll always go back to that. That's kind of why I like teaching kids in that informal setting, because every single year, even though, I mean, I've only been working here for like 6 months, and kids are saying, oh, I remember this from last year. Oh yeah, I remember that, Mr. Or, oh, I remember the speech. And I love that. Like, I love that, you know, they can't remember what they did for their math homework yesterday, but they'll remember like this field trip they had a year ago. And that's why I love environmental education. It just gives them that space to, you know, be curious and go through the scientific method and use all their senses and interact with nature and kind of build that personal connection. And I feel like you're talking about intervention, like being a kid is kind of that point that you're starting to form bonds with the environment, or, you know, you're creating your identity at that moment. And so being an environmental educator for K through 6th grade, I feel like I'm kind of in that moment where they're creating memories with, you know, the creek near their house, or their beach, or the river, and things like that. So I feel lucky to be able to do that. And I came from Maryland, but then I moved and I worked in Tahoe for a while. I worked at 2 organizations in Carson City, Nevada, and Alpine County, California. So really rural places, totally unlike Santa Barbara, very like lake and riverine systems. And it's cool to see the difference between kids there and kids here. Kids here, they know way more about environmental issues than kids there. And I feel like the ocean gets this like huge spotlight that riverine systems just don't get. And I really like, you know, being the person to guide someone through that knowledge and can kind of raise awareness to certain issues that they might not know about yet.
Yeah, I mean, for myself and for many other people that I kind of heard, you know, who've engaged in environmental issues, a lot of it comes down to, well, I used to go hiking as a kid, or, you know, we kind of lived in a woodsy area, and just kind of developed a connection with the natural world at a young age. So
yeah,
that's awesome.
And even with kids who are in, you know, more urban settings, like they still have an environmental identity. It's just different than someone who does go hiking on the weekends and things like that. And you can still talk about environmental issues with, you know, kids that have never been to the beach before, or, you know, they have that connection, that primal connection everybody has. So it's cool to give them that space to be curious and ask questions, and, you know, question the way that their parents do things. And when we talk about, like, you know, plastic, it brings up this whole, you know, slew of questions about, or comments about, oh, I heard about this company that's creating these compostable bags and things like that. Like, I want to give kids the opportunity to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, you work with a bit of bigger kids, right?
Yeah,
so
bigger kids.
What's it like to be in that kind of arena, kind of equipping adults going into probably as a profession into hydrology and watershed management?
It's fun because you get to work with people who are, you know, really engaged in what they're doing. You don't do a PhD unless you really want to, because it's just way too much work for not enough pay. I think what's interesting for me about, you know, watersheds is it gives you a way, like a methodological way, a strategic way to understand the world, right? So I go into a watershed, and over time, as you work with the kind of things I do that are very much looking at watersheds as systems, you understand, oh, if I go into a new watershed, these are some of the questions I want to ask. You know, what is the rainfall rate like? How does it change through the season? How does that relate to the temperature? How is the watershed steep? Is it flat? Is there a riparian zone? How are the processes different up on the ridge? What it does is it gives you a way of getting to know a place. And then it gives you a way of saying, well, how similar is this place to another place? I and my students work in, so for example, Mediterranean type ecosystems are all over the world. They're in Italy, in Spain, in Israel, in parts of South Africa, in Australia, and I actually work with collaborators there. I currently have a project that with some people in Israel looking at pine forests and their response to drought and fire regimes. And because you would think, these guys are in Israel, and then I work with these guys that are in the Pyrenees in Spain, and the Pyrenees look a lot like the California Sierras. So what's kind of fun about what we do is, the Pyrenees for me are far more similar than the Chesapeake Bay watershed, right? From a watershed perspective, they function much more like Santa Barbara than the Chesapeake's a whole nother animal, right? So it gives you a way of getting to know the world. And I think most of us who are scientists, we're interested in deeper understanding. And this gives us a way of interrogating the world that's a very structured way. And from that, you get really rich insights into, oh, how is climate change going to affect the California Sierras? It's probably going to be a little bit like the way it's going to affect the Pyrenees. And so how do we adapt to that, right? If I put some sort of, if I change the land use, if I urbanize in the Chesapeake Bay, the response is going to look really different than urban development in Santa Barbara, how it affects water. So it gives me a structured way of answering those questions in a really place-based way. So it's not some general prescription. Policymakers hate me, right? Because is thinning good for forests? I'm always going to tell you it depends on the place. But when I say it depends on the place, I want to give you tools for going in to say, okay, how does it depend on the place? And that's really what I teach my students, are those tools for really understanding place.
What was it like, after last year's debris flow? What was that, it sounds like Julia, you probably weren't in the area yet, and we heard a bit about Nell's experience with the disaster. What was it like to be teaching about water and how that happened?
It was kind of crazy because we had gotten this large grant from the National Science Foundation several years back to bring fire into the modeling work that I do, right? So we were just on the verge of releasing, a whole bunch of work that we've been doing on fire, and so it was sort of interesting. Then it happens in your backyard, and you're like, wow, as a scientist, you're really interested in this, but of course there's the human dimension to this that you have to balance. And we actually gave a community workshop down at the Granada, myself and some of my colleagues, and I'd never spoken to so many people. The entire Granada was full, right? So, you're a geeky scientist, you work on this stuff for years and nobody cares, and then suddenly but that's life, right? Things come and go. I think what I find, a lot of what I look at is how quickly do these systems recover. And, as tragic as it is, it's sort of amazing. You go walk up, the hikes in Mission Canyon and look at how much vegetation is coming back. Look at how much rain we got this year, and you look at those creeks and they are clear. They're not, like I walked up San Ysidro Canyon on the weekend, and that water doesn't have sediment in it. That's how much the vegetation has come back, right? So, it's an incredible example of watersheds as dynamic systems, and I think there's a lot we can learn from this. But it also, I think, speaks to, as with Hurricane Katrina, right? These were all things that we knew could happen. This was not, in a way, so unexpected, but it's hard to get our heads around rare events, right? Rare extreme events. I think we as a culture, we don't deal with that very well. Human nature doesn't deal with extreme events well. We think if something there's a funny thing, if you tell someone something has a 1 in 100 year probability of happening, they think it's never gonna happen. But that means it does happen occasionally, right? And I think getting people's heads around that is a real challenge in the environment, because big environmental events, sometimes it's the slow, snow is melting earlier every year in the Sierras because of climate change, right? And that's the goldfish problem, right? You don't notice it because it's happening all the time. And then the extreme events, that's when people really want to make changes in the world, right? But they don't last long enough, and then you forget. So I think it's a really interesting thing for scientists, like how do we take advantage of the attention that comes with those events to help educate and help motivate action.
And had you guys done modeling for like this area?
Yeah.
And for what did happen, like what percentage of models could have actually predicted something like that?
So to be clear, we had done modeling of more the fire frequency, right?
Okay.
And that was pretty predictable that you would get a fire. I mean, we all, like, most of the public knows we were going to get fires up there, right? It wasn't so surprising. I don't do sediment and that event, but if you talk to geomorphologists, I mean, there are big rocks at the bottom of San Ysidro Creek. Where did they come from, right? It's very rare that this happens, and it may happen more often in the future, largely just because rainfall intensities may increase. But this has happened before, and it's really, predicting the probability of something isn't enough, right? Because like I said, if you tell someone something's a 1 in a 500 year event, they kind of go, I don't have to worry about it. But that's actually not true. And you do have to worry about the 1 in a 500 year event, because if it's Hurricane Katrina, it really matters.
What kinds of principles do you hope that maybe educated and inspired citizens will live by as a result of your guys' work? And this is kind of more generally for anyone to answer. And then furthermore, how can we get involved and take action in our own lives? It's open to anyone.
You're the educator. You gotta start with me.
Yeah. Well, I think that, for kids, it's really important to know that it's, never too early to start thinking of innovative solutions, and kids get really discouraged when these, global phenomena happen and these issues are so big and they're overwhelming and they're kind of like going over their heads a little bit. But, small choices that people make every day are, that's a lifestyle change that you can create, and you can start that when you're a kid. I had one student tell me in Nevada one time, like, oh, I don't have power over the plastic utensils in my lunch, in the cafeteria. Yeah. She was like, I don't have power over that. Like, I can't change that. And I was like, yes, you can. You can bring your own metal utensils. Like, that's one little lifestyle change that you can make, and it'll affect your entire, way of thinking. You can question authority. You can, talk to your parents about these issues. So I hope that kids kind of get that sense of empowerment, and that's why at Explore Ecology we really focus on solution-based change and making sure we're not, overwhelming the kids, because they get that look of being really scared and really sad when you show them pictures of animals with plastic in their bellies, and we want to make sure that we're talking about, really tangible things that they can do as a 5th grader right now, today. So we talk about, the 3 R's, reduce, reuse, recycle, and that's the simplest way we can take trash out of the landfill. And I think just kids need to realize that they can make change now. And then parents need to give their kids more of a voice. I think even when packing their lunches, they need to participate in that. Going to the grocery store, realizing that, kids are aware of things, and they need to make choices as a consumer. They need to be, aware of things that are placed upon them, and people are always saying, the next generation is what's going to save us, and this youth-driven climate change movement is great. And I think that's so important to acknowledge that, yes, it's that, kids are kind of the future. So I hope that they kind of get that sense of empowerment from our lessons specifically. And then the art from scrap store is like a great example of creative reuse, which is what we talk to the kids a lot about. So just kind of going around your house and thinking of how you can give this product more of a life than just, single use and you throw it away. So.
Can I jump
Yeah.
in on, because, something that we do at the Bren School, which, exactly what you're saying about kids, if you keep just telling, not just kids, adults work the same way. Kids, little adults, really.
Mm-hmm.
And if you keep telling someone, this is the disaster, this is a disaster, what you're doing is bad, what you're doing is bad, eventually it's hard psychologically to deal with that. And you have to also remember that heads of corporations are kids. And they're often kids who are really smart and really creative. And if you can motivate them to make changes, and they also have access to making, design decisions. So we work with people from, Toyota. We work with Adidas. We work with Patagonia. We work with Disney to look at life cycle, like how they can have life cycle analysis, which might save them money, but reduces impacts on the environment. And you would be surprised you get people in those organizations, and sometimes, why did they be, some people just care about money, but that's an overgeneralization. And often, in places where you wouldn't expect, you have people who, they became successful because they like to solve problems in creative ways, right? And so you want to present things to them in ways that empower them. We want to empower kids, but we also want to empower leaders of corporations. You want to, so I think one of the big challenges in environment is, and we really try to do this, and I remember once I was on an airplane, and I was talking to a farmer about, and he was like, I don't believe in climate change, blah, blah, blah. But then I started asking him about, he had amazing data. He'd been monitoring precipitation on his fields and how it had responded to how he could fertilize in different ways, and he had all this long-term data. And essentially he was adapting to climate change. But once you start asking him about, oh, that's really creative what you're doing, you could adapt to the change that we're seeing in temperature. And when he felt empowered, he was suddenly really interested in talking to me, right? So I think, just to build on what you're saying, everything you're saying about kids, it's true of everyone you talk to. You have to, if you want to empower people, you want to give them ways to be creative. You don't want to always have prescriptions. Sometimes we need prescriptions. We need policies around water conservation, and we need policies around not having contaminants in the environment. But we also want to design those policies that leave room for people, corporations, the public, whoever you are, to be creative in coming up with solutions. So we're all kids.
Do we have any questions from the room for our panelists here?
Comment maybe with the question. I'm working here at the college as the director of physical plant, and we had geologists on campus after the event. And the one talked about the wonder of actually seeing the 100-year event. So on campus we actually have these huge boulders, one there up near Emerson, one near the library. And so there's this mystery of how did they get there. And for the geologists, it was actually really quite a powerful experience for them to actually be a part of something they had only studied.
Yep. It's really true, and I probably know some of those geologists, and it's been, I have a friend who's, flying down here as a geomorphologist who's studied these things his whole life and wants to come here to see this. I mean, you're a geology especially, at least I study plants, fire, it happens pretty often, water changes all the time. You gotta be a certain type of person to study geology, because most geologic processes either happen really slowly over thousands of years, or they happen once every 500 years. So it takes a certain person to be into geology, and this is a remarkable event. But even for me to see regrowth after a fire, to go out and walk around it, or to see how the water quality is changing as we go through the seasons. Amazing.
I have a question, comment for Naomi. First of all, I got a kick out of your story about the 1 out of 500 years. I hail from Boulder, Colorado, and 5 years ago we had an event.
Yep.
Just prior to that event, I said I felt so sorry for those people in the upper Mississippi areas where they flood every year, and I say, boy, they're lowlands and they're
Yep.
constantly getting flooded, and I feel sorry, but we're up here at altitude, 5,000 feet to begin with, and we don't have that problem. And 2 weeks later, we had the event in May that
It was a big
was
event.
devastating. And it's amazing how much volume, hydrology that develops in these very short spout areas. Well, you're familiar with that here too. But the question part of this would be the NSF, funding-wise. What do you feel in the future? I mean, is there money still looking at these environmental issues? Are things ebbing? I mean, how are we doing from a federal perspective? Where do you see the future of funding? Has it been affected by what's going on in Washington?
You know, bizarrely, up until this point, the National Science Foundation, you know, is still funding a lot of environmental research, right? Maybe they're not calling it climate change. Maybe they're calling it the food, water, energy nexus, but it's still funding the same research, right? Because for you to understand how, you know, for you to understand food security or water security, you have to understand climate change, you know. I have a student who just got a job at NCAR, which is the National Climate and Atmospheric Research Center in Boulder, which, you know, funds some of the, you know, hundreds of some of the best science, and that's a governmentally funded institution, and there hasn't been talk of NCAR going away, right?
No, it's secure.
You know, and so I think that, you know, the good news is that there's a certain amount of scientific research that's been able to weather, generally is able to weather these ebbs and flows of what's happening in Washington, partly because they have sort of 5-year time horizons anyway, and it's not, I mean, I don't, you know, I'm not a Washington pundit, so I who knows, but right now I would say NSF has been less impacted by the current administration than other programs.
Interesting. Thank you.
Let's, you know, for my sake, you know, selfishly hope that that continues to stay that
So
way.
don't panic right away.
But I think, I mean, public funding for science has, you know, comes and goes anyway, and increasingly, I know in my own research, I'm looking to private sources for funding.
Mm-hmm.
You know, some of the big foundations, but, you know, big companies, you know, there's many sources for funding this type of research.
Closing thought on one thing for me. Michael Bloomberg and the gentleman that runs, is it Keanne, the gentleman that runs that clothing company,
Oh, Patagonia.
Patagonia.
Yeah.
Those two gentlemen, the ex-mayor of New York,
Yeah.
you know, they co-authored this book, and it seemed like, you know, an odd combination, but they're partners. And one of the things he talked about in the first chapter of the book was not to have fear. Don't scare people. Show them that they can have ownership and
Yeah.
deal with it in small pieces. And they look at it from a city perspective. You know, we can attack the issues for environment starting at city level. We don't have to always look up to the feds for answers downstream.
You're so right, like
Yeah.
so much, like greening of the urban environment, and thinking about it from multiple perspectives. I mean, sometimes we get caught, for example, in, well, it's not pristine nature, but it's still nature. You know, those trees you have in your yard, they're cooling, they're using water, they're cycling nitrogen, they're habitat, they're part of an ecosystem, right? And you can engage with that. Like, things happen, things we can do locally are big, right? And there's a lot of creativity there, and hopefully the kids you're training will think about. But I talk a lot, but one more thing I would say, that in order to be creative, you need to understand something. Like, who makes creative, you know, new fashion designs? The people who know fashion, right? Or if you want to invent something new, you have to kind of know a lot about what's happening. So familiarizing people, getting them to pay attention to their environment. You can't solve problems if you're not if you don't pay attention to the environment, you're not going to come up with those creative solutions. So a lot of it's getting people to just pay attention to what's happening around them. Like, notice that the tree uses water, or notice like, whether it's good or bad, just notice what's happening.
more questions?
So it strikes me that Santa Barbara is an unusually easy place to care about watersheds, because our relationship with our watershed is so direct and so comprehensible. It has sometimes occurred to me on my commute to work that I could stand on the bridge on 192 where it crosses over Stevens Park, like essentially where the creeks enter the city of Santa Barbara, see my house from that spot, and see Hendry's Beach, and then see the ocean. So anything that enters the creek happens in that spot where I can see it. And I can see the impacts that my actions have on the creeks and on the watershed in general. I grew up, though, in Orange County, which, is a giant and sort of dramatic watershed, but you experience it very abstractly, by design. The rivers that run through Orange County and that have created the giant floodplains that are Orange County, run in concrete for I don't know how many miles, 60 miles from the mountains to the ocean. And you're actually sort of prevented in a way from seeing that you're in the watershed and from interacting with it. And some of what I wonder is how, for people who live in places where you don't have that kind of direct comprehensible relationship to the watershed, I wonder if you have any ideas for making the watershed less abstract. How do you see where you are and see your impacts in a place where those aren't made visible by this very kind of small dramatic system that we have here?
Yeah. In Nevada, we would teach some kids about the irrigation canals, and because that's how they know their water. Like, they play in those canals, even though it's really dangerous and don't go in there. But, we kind of bring it locally to their map, and we have them label different things, and just like, place-based learning is really great. You need to give a name to that place. So we teach them, or I taught them, all about their local water and how the farmers are using the water, and how the river changes throughout the time and things like that. And I think just knowing, I keep saying the creek near your house, but that's what we have here, the creek near your house. Like, just knowing the name of it, even, you don't even have to know like where it goes, but just knowing like that little lake near your house that might have been man-made, like that's what I grew up with, is man-made lakes in Maryland. And but just like caring about that one body of water, and then watershed is knowing that it all connects to everything else. And I think just focusing on the one body of water is really great for kids and adults too. So at the Watershed Resource Center, we have open hours on the second Sunday of every month. And last Sunday, I had this one guy who's a local. He's been here forever, and he was like looking at the map, and he was like, "Oh my gosh, I never knew that was the name of that little stream that runs behind my house." And I was like, that's why we want to educate people, so that they are familiar with it, even if they can't see it from their house like you're saying. It's just so that you're familiarizing yourself with what it is, because then you have ownership over it, you care for it, you have responsibility for it, you want your kids to see it in the coming years and things like that. So that's why I think.
Yeah, I think exactly. And you think about LA, which is my experience of Orange County, but close enough, right? Same problem, right? When it rains, and where the rivers are? They're the streets. You've seen that, right? Anyone who's lived here, right? So you ask a kid, like, where's that water going? And can you trace it? Can you give him a visual of where that water that's like, when on that day, could you follow that water? How does it get to the ocean? Where does it go? One of the things we're trying to do, and I'm going to plug something just shamelessly here, but we've been, with all these complex simulation models, I've been talking to computer scientists and visualization, immersive reality. There's all kinds of virtual reality stuff out there now. And what we're trying to do is find gamers to link the results of our models of water and carbon and energy and fires and things growing and water moving through the subsurface to computer games, so people can get a visual of that. And we've created one now for a watershed up in the Sierras, but we want to do it for urban environments too. And that's one of kind of my current research areas, is working with these computer scientists to develop games that your students could play, where they could go with, let's say, virtual reality glasses, walk out their front door and see a simulation of where that water goes, right? And play games with that, put more water in and see what would happen. And so we're really thinking about how to do that. And our first version of that, we're actually showcasing as part of an art event that we're having April 11th to the 20th, opening night April 11th down at the Community Arts Workshop, that will showcase our first version of this game, which is nowhere near what it should be, and you're going to look at it and go, oh, they're not going to learn anything from that. But imagine the potential. So that's, one of the things we're trying to do. So please come to our art exhibit. We'll leave flyers here.
And I just want to add to that, my favorite series that we do, it's called the Creek Kids series, and we have a 3-part thing with the kids, and the first lesson we do is to just understand what a watershed is. So we crumple up a piece of paper, and then you draw lines and you spray water on it. You see that the colored lines go down, and they understand it. The second part is the field trip to the Watershed Resource Center. They get to see the beach, they do a beach cleanup, they get to find all these things. And then the last part is they do a school cleanup. And so schools that aren't even near the beach, that are kind of up, in the city and things like that, they see, oh, this food wrapper that is constantly coming up in my schoolyard. I saw that at the beach cleanup that we just did, and I kept seeing that. And they sort of, just like you're saying, they track it through storm drains and things like that. And it's so important for people to realize what they do on land impacts water. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, do you guys have any other concluding remarks or any takeaways for our audience today? Anything else you wanted to share?
Well, I would encourage you all to go see the show at the museum here. It originated in Georgia. It's a traveling show. It's a photography show, a landscape photography show about watersheds, and then they added 4 local people, local photographers, to be in it to give it a local twist to it. But it's a very interesting show. It's definitely worth going to see. And it's up till March 23rd, I think is when it ends.
I have lots of things that my boss told me to say. So like I mentioned, the second Sunday of every month, we have a beach cleanup at Hendry's Beach, open to the public. It's 10 to noon. You can just show up, do it for however long you want, and every month we keep track of all the trash that's found. We weigh it, we tally up different categories. There's something called the Dirty Dozen, which is the most common pollutants found in the ocean. So we kind of track to see if that's, along those same lines. And we find hundreds of pounds of trash every single month. So this is a need in the community. So again, that's second Sunday, 10 to noon, Hendry's. The next one is March 10th. We also have art workshops for kids and adults at Art from Scrap. So usually the ones for adults are Friday nights, and then for kids it's Saturday afternoons. So parents can drop off their kid, and then they can go to the farmer's market and do that.
What age?
You have to be older than 4. Both, yeah. So art workshops are amazing. We usually use materials that come from the store, which is really fun, and then you can create this amazing art project. We're also looking for interns, so if there's college students who want to intern with us at Art from Scrap or at Watershed Resource Center, we need interns. The Environmental Stewardship Awards, we do that for individuals who are K through 12. So if you want to nominate, a kid that you know, or we also have awards for teachers or clubs or classes that are in K through 12. So these awards are, for people who are really dedicated to the environment, who inspire their community. We would just love it if you nominated someone that you know. You can also do self-nomination by March 30th. And then they're awarded at the Earth Day Festival on April 27th or 28th. Last but not least, the Sustainable Table is our big, big event. It's May 25th. It's a farm to table dinner. It's really beautiful. We have, these amazing chefs, and it's all organic food, and it's kind of, to raise money for us, but to also make people aware of farm to table issues and things like that. So tickets are available on our website soon. Not yet, but soon. But everything's on our website, so if you ever want to volunteer or just, know more about the Watershed Resource Center, things like that, it's on our website.
That's exploreecology.org.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming, and thank you all of you for coming. Give them a hand.